right, well, welcome to the Tarzan of the Apes and Comics panel. Again, we have two iconic figures in the business, Roy Thomas and William Stout, are joining me. I'm going to run through, as the moderator, I'm the editor of the Burroughs Bibliophiles. We have the longest standing Edgar Rice Burroughs fanzine. It was approved by Burroughs himself in 1947 and continues in publication. We have some Bibliophiles members here. Excellent. So if you want to join later, grab me. In the meantime, I'm going to run through a set of charts. They aren't meant for you to stare at and take out all the information. I want you to see how long Tarzan as a character has been in comic strips and in comic books. He first appeared in 1929 in strips. First original stories were 1947. He still appears in original stories today in both media. There are more Tarzan original stories in comics than there are in any other medium, including, of course, the 24 novels written by Edgar Rice Burroughs himself, the person who created the character and first appeared in 1912. So we'll just race through this to get you some context about Tarzan and strips. All right, again, first comic strip, 1929. He is credited along with Flash Gordon as being the first adventure strip for adults in American newspaper strips. And it was
What did you say along with what? You said Flash.
I'm in Buck Rogers, sorry. Although it turns out that the strips actually appeared earlier in England just before that. He was already reprinted by the famous Hal Foster. First Foster strips ever done were for Tarzan, and those appeared in a reprint issue that same year. 1931, the Tarzan Sunday started. You can see on the top newspaper strip artists. You'll notice some pretty significant people, especially in the comic book business at World War II and beyond. The Sunday strips, of course, had Hal Foster, Vernon Horgarth, and Russ Manning, and Bob Lugers, and John Solardo, Ray Morrow, and Gil Kane, and Mark Rell. I mean, these are folks, of course, have all been significant in comic books as well. They started reprinting early, which is what happened with many comic strips in the first comic books that were published in the United States. And he appeared in many, many issues, excerpts of Dailies and Sundays, and some text stories. Reprinting in overseas started very quickly. The UK was exceptionally significant number of runs, but he appeared anywhere from India to Brazil, all parts of the world in reprints, and continued all into the 70s and 80s. Big Little Books adapted many a daily strip. You can see how many significant comic book publishers acquired the license for Tarzan over the years, starting with Dell in 1947. And Dynamite Entertainment has continued to publish today, and Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated, 50 years later in plan, has started their own imprint, and they're doing Jane Porter comic books. Again, it started with Dell, which of course the license went to Gold Key in '62. You also had March Comics, and Charlton did some unauthorized. You can see some of the significant artists that were involved in those over those years. Of course, DC and Marvel. DC took over right after the license moved from Gold Key. You can see that Joe Kubert was the critical editor, writer, artist on most of the iconic story adaptations. And then it went to Marvel in, I think, 1977 with Roy Thomas as editor, and wrote probably the first third half of the issues. And of course, the great John Buscema,
Yeah.
Buscema, and his brother Saul. I'd rather say more than
Sal
less.
did. Yes.
Did the pencils for those. Edgar Rice Burroughs, in the meantime, created special strips. Can you not hear? I'm sorry.
Turn it up.
I was worried about I had to
Get a little closer, yeah, to the
and again, overseas, Burroughs Incorporated started overseas stories for comic books and graphic albums with Russ Manning, of course, Bill Stout, Mike Roy, and many others over a short period that were published. And then we had other publishers over the years that also took their shot at original stories. Very significant was Yugoslavian original stories, which are being reprinted today. Graphic novels included Vernon Horgarth adaptations, and of course we've had Jungle Tales of Tarzan adapted again. And these two graphic novels came out in French and German just in the last year or so. You've seen them. Meantime, Malibu took over the Semic stories. That lasted a short time. Then Dark Horse took up the reign. They still have licensing agreements going on. They still can publish. And of course, Dynamite Entertainment started. You'll notice a significant number of crossovers where Tarzan shows up. Batman, Predator, Superman, Catwoman, and of course, Screw. Online strips. The newspaper strips had gone away. ARB Incorporated started a set of online strips in 2012. Roy Thomas was the scripter and still the scripter for the New Adventures and for the classic Tarzan Apes. And they are also doing Son of Tarzan and the Tarzan Twins. Reprinting has been going on for many, many years, especially with Hal Foster and Gordon Hargrove. There's obviously very, very famous strip artists. And these reprints are happening even today. I get contacted by publishers in Germany and other parts of Europe alone, just on these. Comic book stories also, especially thanks to Dark Horse, have been reprinted. So if you want to catch up on those, you can do that. Comics Reviews have been reprinting for many years. Of course, there's the cheaper artist editions. And to close out, Russ Manning and William Stout on one of the Sunday strips in the earlier 70s. There's one of the graphic albums that Russ Manning and Bill Stout worked on for overseas publication in the 70s.
Are they seeing stuff we're not seeing?
Yes.
That's why I keep looking.
And to close out, and we'll move to our panelists, Thomas Greenberg as artist, and Roy Thomas as writer for the first set of the online strips with the New Adventures of Tarzan. You started out as Russ Manning's assistant, the second assistant on the newspaper strips.
Right, and we also work together on the graphic novel.
And so what drew you, that you thought was special about the character then and now?
Oh man, well, I was always a huge Tarzan fan because I love the movies, and I had read the first Tarzan book. I just got an old hardback from a used bookstore, read that. I didn't fall in love with it immediately, but not too long after that, I got a paperback of Warlord of Mars, and it just knocked me out nice. And I found out, wow, there's more of these? And so I read all 10. And then I went back to Tarzan, and the second Tarzan book, it's got the most spectacular opening. It's just great. He's with his friend Darnell, the man who taught him how to speak. And he's in Paris, and he's bored because it's nothing like the jungle of Africa. So he deliberately goes into the worst neighborhoods of Paris at night, hoping he'll be mugged. And it's just a fantastic story, just a great story. But I was drawn into the Burroughs world when they started, Ace started to reprint the Burroughs novels in the paperbacks with those great Frazetta and Roy Krunkle covers. And then you got the bonus of the pen sketches inside. And man, I just lit up. And then I discovered Burroughs Fandom, and I got a subscription to Herbdom. And occasionally I would contribute pieces as a fan artist to that magazine, and Kaz, who published it, would publish them. And then there was an announcement that an unpublished Burroughs book was about to be published. It was called I'm a Barbarian. And it was about Caligula's rule in Rome as told by his own personal slave. And so they got Jeff Jones to illustrate that. I was disappointed in Jeff's drawings. I wanted them to be more detailed, so I did my own set of drawings for the book. And I did each one in a different style. I did one that was Frazetta style, one that was Williamson style, one that was Krenkel style, one that was Infantino and Anderson style. And sent those up, and about 2 years later, Cash printed them and heard them, and I got a phone call from Russ Manning asking me if I would like to be his assistant on the Tarzan Daily and Sunday strips. I was already very aware of Russ Manning and his work. I had all the Magnus robot fighters that he had done. And when he started doing Tarzan, I was so shocked because it was exactly the way I pictured Tarzan in my head when I read the novels. So I was delighted. He became a fantastic mentor, not only a mentor as an artist, but as a human being and as a father. I watched how he interacted with his kids, and I learned so much about being a good father from being with Russ.
Roy, now here Marvel had the rights.
Yes.
Why did you give the character and Burroughs license a few years later?
Well, I gave the character up, as I said, a personal disagreement because I got a call from Marion Burroughs one night in my apartment in LA, and she said she was very upset because we had, in between the other issues, I had started doing occasional adaptations of the Jungle Tales of Tarzan, those 12 or so stories, because that was a good way to have a fill-in. I'm going to have a fill-in issue, and I can give an artist this and that. And she got upset, and she called me up and said, "You can't do any of those." Well, I already checked. Barbara told me that the lawyers had said we could do them. I said, well, if you have a beef, you got a beef with Marvel. They said I could do them. I mean, Marvel's the licensee, not me. If I can't do them anymore, it's okay, but if I was told I could. So, and he said, was very upset because at that time, Vern Hogarth had done his second book, I guess, which was Jungle Tales of Tarzan. He had adapted 2 of them or so, I think, in that. And she said, well, you've even adapted some of the same stories. I said, well, yeah, there's only 12 or whatever of them, so I said, naturally. And some of the language is similar. I said, well, of course. I said, Vern Hogarth and I are both reading Burroughs, and we're adapting his prose. He says, and even some of the language, and the drawings are similar. I said, now there you're going too far, because I happen to know that John Burroughs hated Vern Hogarth's art. He was a thoroughgoing Foster man. Gil Kane liked Hogarth, you could tell, but John Buscema did not like Hogarth. John Buscema doesn't own a copy of that book, or of the Tarzan of the Apes book that come out before. He doesn't like Hogarth, and if there's any coincidence, it's just similarity. You're drawing a person and an ape and a leopard or what, there may be some similarities. I said, I hope you're not accusing us of plagiarism. I says, well, you can hope. And I said, I can do more than that. And I just hung up, and I called Marvel and told her I quit, and that was the end of that. I never had any more contact with her, for the rest of her life. But, I remained on good terms with Banton, and I even owned Edgar Rice Burroughs' personal copy of that first Tarzan reprint comic for years. I bought it for $100.
The Foster one?
Yeah, but the one that first came out, the one that reprinted the Foster, I think I bought it for like $100.
Yeah, a lot of the comics in the early days in the 1930s were just
the way
collections of Sunday
Marvel probably discovered the same thing that DC probably did. I mean, I don't have a lot of inside information there, but they just discovered that because, I'm not saying how much they were, and certainly it's not that Burroughs Incorporated was unreasonable, but between the sales were okay, but they were paying a fair amount for the licensing, and the combination just made it untenable for the 2 books after a little while, and so they discontinued. I wrote the majority of the Tarzan books. Dave Kraft took over after me and so forth, because I adapted the entirety of Jewels of Opar and did several of the Jungle Tales and an annual that had 2 Jungle Tales in it, and so forth. And there were a few issues after. Then at that point they went to original stories, and I had told Stan, I said, I'll do it, but I said, I'm not interested in doing any original Tarzan stories. I said, I'll adapt the novels, but I'm not going to make up any new Tarzan stories. I just, I got enough to do with Conan and other books. I didn't want to get involved in it and having to do it. I was just, but anyway, I guess it was just a business thing. It was a shame. I would have loved to see Marvel go on printing them and, and maybe expand it and so forth, but somehow the economics just weren't quite right.
Did Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated basically present you with a Bible or sorts or set of written guidelines?
No, I had provided them with the pattern how to do. No, they didn't do anything.
Right.
I never wanted anything from the Conan people except, copies of stories that were out in print, and from the Tarzan, just say I can do it. And Star Wars, give me a script, what I didn't want was supervision. With supervision, I had Stanley, I didn't need these other guys too.
Yeah, because you were an editor yourself.
Yeah, if they wanted me, they got me. If they want to supervise me, they get somebody else. I'm still like that, I'm just a lot older now.
Are you aware of Ross Manning having some official guidelines from the corporation on how to deal with Tarzan, or from the United Future Syndicate, which is actually the company that syndicated the strip all those years, since 31?
No, Russ was pretty conscientious about, he really loved Tarzan, and he wasn't going to do anything to radically change the character in any way, or radically exchange the settings or what was going on in the strip. So, yeah, he was a faithful fan, and I think he was one of the closest to adapting Burroughs. His comics, that run he had at Gold Keep was fantastic. Unfortunately, he stopped just before Tarzan at the Earth's core. I was dying to see what he would do with that.
Well, unfortunately, we got to see some of that in some of other Burroughs worlds, thanks to his continuing on the strip and in some of the graphic albums where he took the use of our inner Earth and
the last time for
it's funny, the people that worked on Tarzan, I think the other Burroughs strips too for the most part, but on Tarzan, everybody always, I think they all kind of liked it. Even Jesse, Marsh as an artist, I mean, and what's the name of whoever was writing it? Oh,
Du Bois?
Du Bois, yeah, right. Anyway, they I think everybody just liked it. The only difference was that, of course, during the Dell days, before Russ came in and started doing the adaptations and various things, and the strip, they were still trying to walk a balance from the late 40s through, for a number of years, they were trying to walk a balance between that and the movies. You know, so you had Tarzan and Jane, and it was pretty much like a Burroughs jungle story, because you'd have Paludan occasionally and this and that, but their kid was called Boy, you know, which is totally for the movies. And all of a sudden, one day, they started a comic and said, oh, he doesn't want to be called Boy anymore, his name is Korak now. You know, all of a sudden, the adopted son Boy became the natural son Korak, which was a nice trick right there. But I think everybody I think they all had their own fidelity to it. I mean, everybody has his own interpretation of what Tarzan should be, but in their own way, they were all trying to be faithful, except that for a while they were trying to bridge the gap, you know, between the Weisbiller and the Lex Barker and even Gordon Scott movies.
Yeah, they often even used photos of those movie Tarzans on the cover
Yeah,
of the comics.
I guess Scott later, and they never had any of Weisbiller, I don't think, but they started with Lex Barker, and I think they kept up. Didn't they keep up a little with Gordon Scott, or at least they were modeling their paintings off of it?
There were quite a few Gordon Scott
Yeah,
photos.
I could never take Gordon Scott as Tarzan. I loved Weisbiller. Even Lex Barker was civilized, because I knew that Tarzan was really more civilized than he was in the movies. Gordon Scott, I don't know, he was just too big. I felt the damn vines are gonna break. They're not gonna stop. You know, I could never take Gordon Scott.
I like Jock Mahoney.
Jock Mahoney made it good. Which one? The one that started out India, or the guy who was like 30 or 40 pounds later by the time they finished?
He got super sick in it.
Yeah, I know. He lost like pounds and pounds while they were making that movie. You can tell as you go see it, he gets thinner and thinner as he goes along.
Yeah, that movie literally almost killed him, and they think may have actually shortened his life, because of the illnesses he got going into contaminated water and such, which has happened to more than one Tarzan actor.
Well, it started out with, what was the thing that played the act, it wasn't, what was the actor? Trader Harn.
Right.
Trader Harn, the woman who played the jungle goddess character in Trader Harn, she got some kind of disease and sued the thing and so forth. I think she never, worked again and so
never
forth,
recovered?
because she would have had a great career, but she got sick. I mean, it's dangerous to be, running around in Africa or even Hollywood,
In TV Guide, they ran a picture of Ron Neely, who was the TV Tarzan, and it was a full body shot, and it was pointing out all the injuries he had.
including all the chip fights, as I recall.
Including the chimp fights, yeah.
Yeah.
And this is why comic books and comic strips are good. You never endanger an actor and actress. You can do wild travels through the jungles and beasts fighting, and you don't have to worry about hurting anybody. You can do some great posing that probably wouldn't work physically. And in fact, that's one of my questions is, when Marvel gave up the license in '79, comic books themselves in the United States pretty much shut down for a while. In fact, it wasn't until Semic started, and this is actually overseas, but the gentleman named Henning Cord who started this program, he worked obviously with the corporation and set up, they created the Bible, or I should say chronology and all sorts of things, and started enlisting writers and artists, some of them quite well known in the United States, to start writing stories that would fit in this chronology in and around the original Burroughs novels. But that again, there was this period of several years, and I've always wondered if that was because of licensing fees, because of changing on cultural views.
Well, it was definitely licensing fees from Marvel's viewpoint. When I told him, I said, well, couldn't you renegotiate the fees or something? Because, it was to Burroughs' advantage too, to have the comics continue. I don't say they should lose money on it, but you don't have to make much money. Like when we offered Conan, I actually offered them more than I was authorized to offer them. It was like $200 an issue and no royalties. Now obviously Tarzan was going to get more than that, but the next thing you know, Conan was able to be published under those circumstances for years and years, and they had a 30-year thing for a relatively minor character compared to Tarzan. But Tarzan should have continued there. Marvel would have continued it, except that they couldn't make money because of the licensing fee, and maybe they tried to make a deal and they just couldn't. So I'm not blaming anybody, it's all economics,
Because obviously I'm curious if there was a cultural reason in the United States at the time that suggested there had to be a reinterpretation of the character or some adaptation of the character, or if in fact there was another reason. And then of course that brings me, if you have no answer for that, While Tarzan is being published today still in comic books and comic strips, thanks to the online strips that were started with the corporation, what do you think, and I'll start with Bill first, what do you think might help increase the popularity of characters with today's audiences, including young audiences, that we haven't tried before, that might bring this character into greater sales and prominence?
Man, that's the million-dollar question. How do we get new young readers to embrace Burroughs and read his novels? And I really don't know.
Well, you think about it, I remember in the 60s at least, there was I think it was in the 60s, might have been late 50s, sometime in that period, they had a worldwide survey, and the three, at least for English language, the three best-known fictional characters were Tarzan, Superman, and Sherlock Holmes.
Right.
Now, the funny thing is, I don't know about how healthy Sherlock Holmes is, but Superman comics, you can't give away right now. Batman doing okay, but Superman somehow, is not very healthy and so forth. And Tarzan's having problems. Sometimes characters they have a natural life and then they die. I mean, there are a lot of characters that were really super famous at one time, Buffalo Bill or whoever, and they just vanish. And it doesn't mean that there might still be a life there, but the time when you could make them as popular as they once were, Conan was super popular for 30 years, and then somewhere along the line it kind of lost its footing. And while there have been Conan comics, all the way through, they've never been as popular as they were through at least maybe the early 80s or so.
Yeah, it was amazing. When I was working on Conan the Barbarian in Madrid, I was trying to convince the producers how popular Conan was and how important the film was going to be. And I took them to El Rastro, which is the big giant flea market in Madrid, and I pointed to one city block and tables, people selling stuff. Actually, I pointed at 2 city blocks, and I said, all they're selling is Conan. And they were like, what? I said, yeah, Conan magazines, Conan comics, Conan books. It's that popular that it takes up 2 entire blocks at the flea market.
Damn.
There's always been a nice market for the jungle type stuff. For Tarzan, Conan is sort of like that in a way, because off and on. And also, when you go to a lot of countries, Scandinavia, and I discovered Australia, and especially New Zealand, the Phantom, which is practically unknown here, is still huge there. This guy in this costume running around in the jungle with his dog and his horse, and everything. And if you'd ask 10 people back in the States, several of them wouldn't be able to tell you who the Phantom was. And again, when I went to this convention in New Orleans back in 2001, they had tables and tables that were nothing but the Phantom. I mean, part of it's cultural too. And Tarzan is just one of these series right now that's like the Phantom, that's more popular outside the United States than in. Whether you'll ever be able to get it back, I hope so. I mean, that's one of the reasons when Tom Grinberg suggested that, that I work with him and we make a strip, and had convinced Jim Solis at Burroughs to give it a try. I thought, well, it's good because I like the idea of trying to revive it a little bit, keep giving an online presence. At least there'd be a strip somewhere. If it can't be in a newspaper in the United States, at least it would be online.
I think you could make a great miniseries. That might be an avenue to increase readership.
What did you think of the movie that they did a few years ago?
Tarzan?
Yeah.
I loved it.
It was pretty good.
With Alexander Skarsgård?
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was a thing.
Was he in that too? I remember that girl. I don't remember him.
How many of y'all saw The Legend of Tarzan, 2016 movie?
Yeah. I love that. I love gray stuff too. I worked on the advertising for
That had a lot of good stuff in it. Yeah.
I worked on the advertising for the terrible Bo Derek Tarzan too.
Oh, yes.
How many saw Bo Derek and Tarzan? Oh, right.
It's all half of it.
I will say
I thought that movie was called Jane.
I will say that there's clearly a tie with the films and popularity around the world that certainly boosted. But Burroughs himself was still a multi-million-dollar seller of books. He was potentially one of the top 2 writers in terms of popularity in the 30s. He and Zane Grey. So that's not a small thing. It just happened he didn't write Catcher in the Rye, so people tend to poo-poo stuff. But he had a significant cultural impact, directly and indirectly, around the world. And the fact is, they still are doing some Tarzan online comics, and they are still doing original stories in comic books, and there's still reprints of all these.
And people still know who Tarzan is.
Right.
Anyway, it hasn't vanished from the culture, it's just nobody buys books about it much.
But we would like to see the readership go up. And with that in mind, because we are talking about comments. Well, I'll ask you first, who would you like to have seen, one or more artists, to draw Tarzan who actually never did that you were aware of? Anyone ever come to mind?
Not really, because almost everybody that I think of got a shot at Tarzan at some stage or the other. My favorite of all time is Joe Cooper, because he's one of my favorite artists, and I didn't like his writing as much. I felt it was a little too spared, but he and I never agreed on writing. But he was my favorite. Russ Manning was good. Russ was a little tamer than my vision of Tarzan, but he was really good, and I love those comic books. John Buscema, especially when he was, the first couple of issues, inked his own stuff. We did a couple of his stories. I was really pleased with those. Then he started doing breakdowns that were quite as good. Gil Kane was sort of interesting. I don't think he was a great Tarzan artist, but he did interesting stuff and so forth, had his own take on it. But I, of course, I like Foster and Hogarth, and, I mean, there's a lot of, I'd like to say, what was it Bob Dylan once said about singing? Is I just like what everybody else likes. And it turns out probably I like the people who were the most popular and best artists. I don't remember anybody that I would have liked to have seen. I mean, I don't think there would have been anything to be gained by a Jack Kirby Tarzan particularly, or a Steve Ditko Tarzan. I mean, Sam Glanzman Tarzan was probably better than that. That was actually fairly good.
Bill, your thoughts about artists that never touched a Tarzan figure?
It's hard to top Foster. I mean, Russ was a huge Hal Foster fan. One day I made a remark about preferring Hogarth over Foster. Russ put down his pen, put down his pencil, marked over his flat files, and started showing me Foster stuff that just blew me away. It was like, oh, I was so wrong.
John Buscema would have done the same thing to me, and if I mentioned anything about Hogarth, he would go, I hate Hogarth, he's Foster. Because he was so pleased, I had for several years, I had an original Tarzan by Foster from the Egyptian sequence, one where this giant statue falls. I don't know why I ever let that go, but I mean, I was real pleased with that. He was just fascinated, because, of course, the thing that he did is, Buddy says, you got it hanging up in your living room. He says, I wouldn't have it hanging up in the living room. That was comic art, and that wasn't good enough to him. I said, listen, I'd rather have this. Anybody can order a print of Degas or something like this, and I like that, some of that artwork, but I'd rather have an original by Foster hanging up in my living room than a print by Degas.
Yeah, we were talking about the brutality of playing Tarzan, and I saw this interview with Alexander Skarsgård, and the interviewer asked him about the experience of being Tarzan and how hard that was physically. And Skarsgård's only reply was he didn't say anything; he just started crying in memory of what he had to go through to get that body and to play that character.
That gorilla really tore him up. I thought they made a good choice when they had him running around in pants a lot, because it helped identify. It was still the same character, but it somehow not going into either a lion skin or a leopard skin or something was probably a nice touch for that movie. They had a lot of good.
Yeah,
I was talking to Mike Richardson. I guess he was an advisor in that movie and so forth.
and they had, like in the novel, swinging branch to branch, not on vines.
Right. I have to keep telling the artists in those two Tarzan strips. I said, I don't want to see him swinging on a vine. I was just like, maybe just down to here. I said, I don't want to see any vine swinging in this strip. I said, we're doing Tarzan here. We're not. I love Johnny Weissmuller, but we're not doing Johnny Weissmuller here.
With one more idea about a modern interpretation of Tarzan and what you know about what's in comic books in particular. Do you think that potentially ratcheting up more of the animal and the brutality side, because Tarzan was actually split between two worlds. He was raised in ape and really would fall into being an animal, as Burroughs would describe it quite often.
And he had many animal best friends like John, the lion.
But he would take on this veneer of civilization, because he also, of course, has a role in Brits. And of course, he did this for the love of a good woman. People forget that Burroughs wrote romance novels, starting in 1911, 1912. All his books, except for a couple, were romance novels. I'm always surprised that you didn't see what was come out under a different imprint at least one time in the last 40, 50 years. But the question is would this potentially play better in today's markets if there was a little less civilized?
You're going to have PETA coming down on you, killing a leopard, killing a lion. I mean, Tarzan killed more lions than Africa has practically.
Yeah, Burroughs kind of freeformed some of his novels, and that was a pretty easy thing to do.
At least he got rid of the tiger.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question, and we'll open up the Q&A. Do you have any unique or special experience or memory about Tarzan over the years, be it in the comic book industry or outside of it?
James Costin and Tarzan finds a mate.
Yeah, that was good. Probably a body double though, but still. My favorite is spending an evening with Johnny Weissmuller, actually. In '76, I was doing a convention in either Dallas or Houston, I forget, because I was split two different between them. Johnny Weissmuller was gonna be at this thing. I wanted to meet him, because ever since first movie I had ever seen was Tarzan's Desert Mystery in 1943 or 4 when I was like 3 years old. I can still remember that. And so I wanted to meet this guy. And I said, well, I'm not gonna get to meet him. He's the big star. Comic book people, it was a comics convention, but they didn't treat him like the same way they were gonna treat Johnny Weissmuller. And so Johnny and his little diminutive European wife, I don't remember her name, very short lady, very nice. And so I'm walking down the hall of my hotel, and I look in the door, and I see a couple of people from the convention are leading Weissmuller into this room to show him the room. I said, well, this is my chance. I'm not that shy, So I just walk in, and I walk up. They go to, nobody was supposed to stop me, but I mean, they just were surprised. I just walked up and I said, hello, Mr. Weissmuller. I just want to introduce myself and just say how much I enjoyed your movies since I was like 3 years old. And he just, said a couple of words, then I left. I said, that's fine. That evening, they have a big dinner. Russ Cochran was there. He did a better Tarzan yell even than Weissmuller was doing every 10 minutes. And so they're all there, and Weissmuller's at another table about 20, 30 feet away, so that's the end of that. So then that evening, we all get back fairly early, so I said, I'll go to the disco. They have a disco in there, with really a band, so a disco, they play that kind of music. And I walk in, by myself, there was either suddenly I look over and there's Johnny and his wife, at a table with drinks, and she recognized me from the time I introduced myself to her, I guess. So she's wait over, come over. He said, no, come on. She had to have somebody to talk to. Johnny was just drinking and yelling as Tarzan. So I just, had a good time sitting around. I know that the next morning Johnny Weissmuller would not have remembered meeting me, but I remember meeting him. That was, a big thrill to me because he wasn't Burroughs' Tarzan, but he was a good character in his own right. Since I was like 10 years old, I always had to have this, you probably did too, dichotomize my mind between the movie Tarzan and the book Tarzan that I read. And I knew they weren't quite the same character. And I love that, what is it, Tarzan and the Lion Man, where they have Tarzan Goes to Hollywood, where they're making a movie about the Tarzan-like character. And I love that.
They said he wasn't good enough to play Tarzan.
He wasn't good
They were
enough.
ticked when he killed a lion on set that accidentally went nuts.
Yeah.
So they
Isn't that what
fired him.
happened though with, what's his name, the first Elmo Lincoln, the first one, didn't that lion die when they were fighting? The lion died as they were fighting him or something? No, I don't know what it was. He was lying down, it was a stuffed one with a bunch of gas. That's what it was. It wasn't that he died, it was that he was already dead and stuffed. And when Elmo Lincoln put his leg on him to, do his yell, the weight of the leg pushed the air in, and all of a sudden this woof, like a big breath, and Elmo Lincoln jumps out of his skin because he thinks the lion is a lion. And that goes way back to 1918.
And that is on film. But again, it just shows you that what you can do in the comic book and comic strips, or $200 million of special effects, to get at the Burroughs Tarzan, where you can really get into the character and get into, because he really was in many ways the first superhero of American literature, and really spawned many direct or indirect copycats. I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. That's okay with you all. If you have a question about Tarzan in any form, and just speak up loudly. A gentleman in the red shirt, and then the gentleman right next to you.
So I just like your opinion. My favorite Tarzan artist, and I know the figures were somewhat static, but the backgrounds of Jesse Marsh just blow me away, and I'd like to get your feedback. How do you see Jesse as an artist? Because I have to admit he's also one of my all-time favorite
As an
comic
artist.
artists.
Yeah, Jesse was best friends with Russ. Russ was best friends with Jesse. They went to
Cool.
art school together. And it was Russ who gave me a whole new appreciation for Jesse Marsh's stuff. Because on the surface, to my young mind, it looked sort of dull, but Russ pointed out, look at the forest. Those are real forests. Those are not romanticized. When you see a real forest, you see a bunch of leaves. You don't see huge, big banana leaves. And so I thought, wow, I never thought of it that way. And he said, Jesse had an unusual way of working in that he would draw the outline, the silhouette, with a pen and then fill in the rest with a brush. But he wouldn't actually draw the figures, he would just draw the silhouette outline of everything and then fill it in. Very unusual. I don't know any other comic artist that works that way.
Yeah, I had that feeling as a kid of 8 or 10, so when it started, it was good, it was a little bit, quiet and so forth, but there was, I don't know, even then, I think I could sense that there was a certain integrity to it, so I would stick with it. He's told a really good story. I mean, he's worked from script, but still, he told a good story. When he drew the black people, they looked really good, they looked like real people, they weren't just stereotypes, it wasn't the same guy reproduced over and over again. And, he's a very unappreciated artist, and I can sort of see why he was. Now, his Mars wasn't quite as good because he ended up putting him in all this weird clothes that didn't work, but his Tarzan is really very good. I think Russ started out really taking over Brothers as a spear from
Right.
him, didn't he?
Yeah, and then moved on to taking over.
And then Tarzan, yeah.
In fact, Russ Manning appreciated Jesse Marsh, who really got him into what's called People of Doubt
Yeah.
at Western Publishing. They wrote an article about Jesse Marsh and why he was such a great artist. And of course, one of the things he said was his way of laying out a panel on the page was amazingly good. Gentleman in the white shirt.
Yeah, I'm just curious, Roy, if you talk a little bit about the artists that have been doing the Tarzan strips online, Tom Greenberg and Benita,
Yeah.
and the current.
Well, I mean,
just their experiences.
I don't really, I've never met any of them. Well, no, Tom Greenberg I did meet at a convention or so for a couple of seconds. But Greenberg was the one that came up with the idea of doing it. He was gonna work with another writer, but somehow it didn't work out. He did a couple of strips, but he didn't want, suddenly he approached me to do it, and we got along fine. But he was just such a meticulous worker with this Rosette-ish style of his. I hope he wouldn't mind saying it. There was obviously a little bit of Frank Rosette in there. But he, and I just loved it, but unfortunately by after one, he just felt he couldn't afford it anymore, even though he could sell his, you may have heard me talk before, that he said the pages that sold the best were the ones with cats in them. Women too, and cats. So remember the last 2 strips he did, each of them has a leopard tucked away in a corner or somewhere, so make a few extra bucks on the bus cock inside. And as the others, the next person came up was a Benito Gallejo, who's now doing, I think, some books for Dynamite, of the Lord of the Jungle, or whatever their Tarzan thing is. They sort of swiped him out from under me. They didn't get me to write, they got him to draw some. He's basically a John Buscema clone in a way. I mean, he's obviously very influenced by John Buscema. I sort of like that because there's no John Buscema around anymore, and his brother Sal had stopped working like that after a few years. So I like working with him. We're now doing, the one we're just now starting is basically Tarzan and the Time Machine. It's basically, I have him meet the time traveler from that and so forth. And because I discovered that Ween was not really ever shown dead in the novel, so I figured I'd deal with that. And Tarzan is there with Nakima, and I made up since I had a Paladon adventure right before that Gallejo and I did, I loved the idea of these striped lions. They had two different kinds of lions in that world. They're smaller, so I had this big lion. Instead of a Jatbalja, I made up a new one, Zujato, which means just big Jato or something. Jato being what the animal is, and having a lot of fun with it. Tarzan the Apes has been a little more problematical. I started out with Pablo Marcos, who had drawn a little Tarzan for Marvel and Conan and stuff, but he got ill and he couldn't continue working on a script that really wasn't making much money. Got another young guy named Corey Furman, who does a lot of good drawings, a little less polished. But just the other day, I guess he decided he had to leave because he just couldn't make enough money. So right now I'm waiting for Jim Sullis. Before that, I've usually had suggested people, but I didn't really have that many contacts with artists that I thought. So I asked him to suggest some people about people who are always sending the stuff in, wanting to do some Burroughs strip. So we'll get another thing going. And then what I did with Tarzan the Apes, of course, was started off with Tarzan, and then when I get to the point where the Jungle Tales kicked in, I adapted all of them before I jumped in. So I did all that before he meets Jane. He doesn't meet Jane until about 200 and something strips in, But the artists are really good. They all work very hard, and a lot of integrity, and I'm hoping to continue on, for a long time. And still, as soon as we finish Tarzan the Apes, we'll go on to our third book. That'll we'll do Return, and we'll do all that weird stuff in France and playing cards on the boat and all that stuff. But the artists have been, really good. They all put in a lot of work.
There is no doubt that pay has an impact, and in fact, Russ Manning, and he did the strip for how many years? 14, 15 years, I
Yeah.
think, and he got one pay raise. And that's in a syndicate. The syndicate actually owned all that, the business. So, these are economics, as Roy Thomas pointed out. Marvel left the license.
My wife would love it if I quit doing Tarzan. She would love if I quit doing all the Burroughs strips, but, I won't do it,
Which in many ways shows the dedication of artists and writers to.
But I'm on my second wife too, so.
So we'll excise that out of the recordings.
Yeah, you were talking about the romance of Burroughs' movies. And when I was working on John Carter of Mars, we had assembled a pretty amazing art department. It was Bernie Wrightson, Mike Kaluta, myself, the fellow who designed most of the Star Wars 1, 2, and 3, Ian McKay. And we went around the tables, and the question was, what should this movie be? What is the essence of this film? And both Ian McKay and I agree, it was the greatest love story ever told. It was a love that transcended two planets. And we thought with that kind of bones, we could make a great movie.
She wore too many clothes.
That
was not Deja. I like that movie. I think it deserved a much better fate than it got.
Yeah.
But Deja Thoris was a real disappointment to me. They had to turn her into a scientist, of course. Why not a nuclear scientist?
Yeah, I was disappointed by the casting.
yeah.
She could have been his mom, he could have been her son.
Yeah.
There was no chemistry.
Yeah, there wasn't the romance that you envisioned. There had been, but because the other stuff with him and all that stuff has a really wonderful feel. Part of the problem is just that between Star Wars and Avatar, they had swiped so much Burroughs already
Return
that
of the
he didn't.
Jedi is a Barsumian movie.
Yeah, he didn't seem as original because he's copying Star Wars, like Dune did. Dune's copying Star Wars.
It is interesting that the first two Weissman movies are potentially the most popular and enjoyed movies, and they are truly romance-based movies.
You really sense the affection that Tarzan and Jane had for each other in both of those films.
Not bad for an Olympic swimmer.
We're talking about the first Tarzan.
The first two,
Tarzan,
right,
Tarzan,
Tarzan's Mane.
Yeah, right.
Tarzan's Mane was the only film Cedric Gibbons ever directed. He was the main art director at MGM. There's him on every film, but that was the only one he directed himself.
Well, I'll ask one question, I'll put it out for Q&A. Very quickly, given the fact that I'm curious how we might get younger people interested in Tarzan, is there any other possible crossover with Tarzan of the Apes with another character that you think might expand an audience? Think about that.
With everybody, Superman, Batman.
I'm sorry?
Crow.
In fact, when Dark Horse, as you know, took the license, the very first thing they did was Tarzan versus Predator. So that was Tarzan versus Predator. That was not an accident. Predator was huge at the time when that comic miniseries came out. More questions. I got 5.5 minutes. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Well, sort of to answer your question, I teach 7th grade English, and I have trouble getting them to read words, let alone specific stories. And one of the big things that you hear is, well, that's old. Harry Potter is old and outdated, and they want a newer character. So I've even tried abbreviated versions of Treasure Island, for example, and the level of rejection on it is very interesting because of that perception. So, whereas I love an idea of, Tarzan meets the time traveler, that, I guess you were talking about Orson Welles, that's a great idea, but they're not gonna.
Well, yeah, but that strip's not written for kids, really.
Right,
There'll
but
be kids, but we're not making
that's
any
not
concession
even,
to kids.
but even any kind of style of even art or storytelling that they're gonna process as old is going to be a challenge. And I know some of these stories are not child-oriented, but it's almost gonna have to be, you look at Marvel's interest is more based on the movies rather than books and stuff.
But 100 years, 110 years, 11, whatever, it's a pretty good run if it didn't ever come back. I mean, how many characters last that long, and so forth, and they're still around and people still know who it is. Obviously, we'd all like to see is that become more, more popular. I'd like to see more Conan awareness, more of this, that, and that, and so forth. But, kids are gonna, like you say, Harry Potter's, kids will just discover that we discovered Superman, or we discovered Conan, or we discovered, The Shadow, or whatever we discovered on our own. No, we didn't have parents, teachers telling us. No teacher ever told me to read Tarzan. I wish they had, but, I had to find it on my own. Someday, maybe there'll be a kind of a revival. You can't be 100% sure, but it'll have to come naturally. You can't force it, really. You can, you'll sell a few books for a month or two with Predator, or with Superman, or Batman, or whatever, but that's not gonna help Tarzan too much, because are they gonna come back the next month when he doesn't have Batman with him, or he doesn't have, Predator, or whatever? You just keep trying. If you get lucky, you might hit it.
And the hope is always discovery, isn't it?
Yeah, my American literature book in high school had Ray Bradbury's The Sound of Thunder.
Didn't have that when I was growing up. Of course, it was too new when I was growing up. I don't know if it had been written yet.
I can say that a number of fans of my generation really got into Burroughs through Gold Key comic books and potentially even the DC Marvels, and discovered the novels. So sometimes the multimedia actually does help feed on itself, which is, and plus you get to see a great deal of talent.
Are there video games of Tarzan? There must be.
Bill, you can talk later about the issue of gaming, because I know Conan had a huge boost, and it still does because of gaming. I wouldn't mind talking to this gentleman, because believe it or not, in 2011, there was a reading program done with the middle schoolers that took with the Princes of Mars, because they managed to force them, and once they started reading, they started enjoying it. It was a great divide to get into the start. But I seriously would love to talk to you later. We have time for one more question, if anyone's got a question for either Roy or Bill. Sir.
So Roy, when we were talking about Marvel getting the rights to the Burroughs characters, it sounded like you and Stan had already been talking about it for a while.
I'm sorry, what about it? I thought that I hadn't already said.
Oh, I said, when you were talking about Marvel getting the rights to the Burroughs characters, it sounded like you and Stan had already been discussing what that might look like.
Well, we just, back in 1969-70, when we were first doing it, it was just the idea of getting them. We didn't get any further because we discovered that DC had the rights, so we weren't gonna get them. So, we're not gonna waste time talking about it. We just concentrated on Conan and all the other stuff. And by the second time, when Stan had made the deal, he asked me not to, just to say which things we should do and why, and, write a little paragraph about each of these, and I did a dozen or so of those, and so forth. But again, that was just a broad outline. Then when we did them, it was up to Marv Wolfman and me to decide what Tarzan and John Carter did,
Okay, well, I was curious, since you tried to leap on to John Carter, if you already have a rough idea of what sort of direction you would like to take.
Well, I mean, Marv and I would have started right away, I just started over doing Princess of Mars right away. I didn't care if Marv had done it 3 weeks before. I'd have done my own version. He had done his with Murphy Anderson. I'd have been doing mine with probably Gil Kane. Gil Kane wanted me to do it, but I said, because he and Marv didn't get along. Well, Marv got along and Gil didn't. But I said, no, I'm not going to fight Marv over this. We're friends. I said, I'm not going to try to get it away from him. I might be able to, but I'm not going to. I just had to wait, another couple of decades to get a chance to write John Carter.
All right, we have hit our time. I want to thank Roy and Bill.